One more. Okay. All right. Many people have commented on the similarities between the proposed TPPA and the aborted MAI of the 1990s, not to be confused with AMI, which has been in the news somewhat more recently. It's something different. Another problem. The multilateral agreement on investment was the pinnacle of hubris by the capitalist triumphalists of that decade. It was an attempt to achieve, with one king Hutt, a binding, globally enforceable international treaty to subject the world to transnational corporate rule. Now, for the conspiracy theorists that get excited by phrases like one world government and the new world order, this really was an attempt to convert that into reality. The people of the world have grown used to increasingly gigantic corporate takeovers. This was the daddy of them all, an attempt by big business to take over the world. And it failed miserably. It was defeated by an inspirational campaign both in New Zealand and right around the world. Now, if you were involved with the Alliance, or New Zealand First, or the Maori movement, or any one of a number of other groups in the 1990s, you'll remember the issue and the campaign very clearly. That campaign was a model of both national and international campaigning. It was a shining light in a decade where transnational corporate capitalism saw itself as being the status quo for the indefinite future, backed up by the unchallengeable military might of the world's sole superpower, the US. It was the decade where, famously, history was declared to have ended. This was a battle fought and won well before the massive anti-capitalist and anti-World World Trade Organization protests of the late 90s and turn of the century, well before the massive international anti-Iraq war and anti-imperialist movement of a decade ago, and well before the global financial crisis rendered capitalism itself a rather more shaky proposition than only a few years ago. Now, I mention this because people get the message rammed down their throats all the time by politicians, academics, experts, and the media that, quote, you can't fight City Hall. I can remember sitting in the Christchurch Town Hall in 1991 with thousands of other Christchurch workers with the assembled leadership of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions sitting up on a stage, and they said, you can't fight the government, leave all this Employment Contracts Act stuff to us, and we'll sort it out for you. And we all know which way that went, and we all know how many boards of directors Ken Douglas has now been on since. So I would say actually the message is, oh yes, you can fight City Hall, you can fight the government, and the complete defeat of the MAI proves exactly that point. Actually, try telling that to the people of Egypt or Tunisia if you want more current examples. Over and above all this is the fact that despite the TPPA being a proposed multilateral agreement involving 9 countries at present, it is the means to effect a free trade agreement with the United States. And New Zealand's relationship with the US is different than with any other country with which we have any kind of trade agreement. The great majority of New Zealanders don't want to be sucked back into a military alliance with the US, nor do they want our country to be reabsorbed into the American empire. You don't need me to spell out the history. New Zealand being out of ANZUS and nuclear free has gone well beyond being the status quo. It is now part of the political furniture and is virtually part of the DNA of being a New Zealander. It's used in bloody beer advertisements, for God's sake. Even in the white-hot hysteria of the early post-9/11 years, Helen Clark took great care to keep New Zealand out of the Iraq invasion and made only a token commitment to the illegal occupation of that unfortunate country. Afghanistan, of course, is another matter, and governments led by both Labour and National have played shameful roles in the invasion and seemingly permanent war in that country. At least the good old alliance had the decency to tear itself to pieces and eject itself out of Parliament as a result of its internal bust-up over the issue when it was Labour's coalition partner, so God bless the alliance. Throughout the whole period, New Zealand was officially in bad odour with the US because of the ANZUS row. The secret intelligence relationship continued undisturbed, and as we know from WikiLeaks, was covertly fully restored on a specific date in 2009. August the 29th, 2009 was the actual date in which New Zealand and America officially fully restored intelligence ties. An action so sensitive that that same WikiLeaks cable made clear that the order was to deny it if it became public. The most important manifestation of that secret intelligence relationship is the Waihopai spy base in Marlborough, which dates exactly to the year that the nuclear-free law was passed, namely 1987. Both Waihopai and the nuclear-free law have one person in common, namely David Alongi. It is New Zealand's most important contribution to all and any American wars. Now, I also work for the Anti-Bases campaign, which has called for the closure of that spy base from when it was first announced. Waihopai is operated by New Zealand's Government Communications Security Bureau, which operates out of Freiburg House in Wellington, GCSB, headed by our next Governor-General, in the interests of the foreign powers grouped together in the super-secret UK-USA agreement, which shares global electronic and signals intelligence among the intelligence agencies of the US, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Its satellite interception dishes in Marlborough intercept a huge volume of civilian telephone calls, telexes, faxes, email and computer data communications. It spies on our Asia-Pacific neighbours and forwards the material onto the major partners in the UK-USA agreement, specifically the US National Security Agency, the NSA, which is the world's biggest intelligence agency, double the size of the CIA. Its targets are international civilian communications involving New Zealanders, including the interception of international phone calls. Post 9/11, the GCSB and Waihopai now spy further afield to those regions where the US is waging wars. The codename for this, Echelon, has become notorious worldwide as the vast scope of its spying has become public. New Zealand is an integral, albeit junior part, of a global spying network, a network that is ultimately accountable only to its own constituent agencies, not governments, and certainly not citizens. Now, I don't have time in this speech to go into further details about Waihopai. Have a look at the Anti-Basis Campaigns workshop website, which is there, that one, ABC. No flyers left for ABC. The TPPA has been presented quite openly by its proponents as New Zealand's reward for being a loyal satellite of the US. Now, we call ourselves an ally, but in the good old days of the Cold War, the Soviet Union never had allies as far as the West was concerned, only satellites. So satellite is good enough for me when it comes to describing New Zealand's relationship to the United States. I think the American Empire, I think we're the sort of equivalent maybe of like Bulgaria when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. So we're the Bulgarians of the South Pacific as far as the Yanks are concerned. We provide some warm bodies and a few light armoured vehicles or something when they can spare them from Christchurch. In the days of the Vietnam War, when the Holyoake government had pretty much disappeared over Uncle Sam's ass, our policy of sending troops to help fight America's wars was popularly known as guns for butter. Now that both major parties see New Zealand's trade policy as being that whatever is good for Fonterra is good for the country, the slogan could be updated to being guns for milk. The principle is the same. If little old New Zealand does its bit to serve American military and political interests, it might, just might, get a sniff of a reward in the shape of a free trade agreement. And at that point, it's worth saying that we always get told that all these sacrifices and concessions, etc., will be worthwhile, because if we get a free trade agreement with America, their country, their economy will be thrown open to New Zealand dairy products, specifically Fonterra. You can forget that one, because the American dairy industry, there's no secret about it. They've made it very plain. The American dairy industry is very well organised, very well connected, put lots of money into both Democrats and Republicans, and they have made very clear that they will do anything to stop the dairy industry of any other country, let alone New Zealand, getting into their extremely protected, subsidised bloody sector. There's no secret about that. Commentators well to the right of me and the New Zealand media have also made that point very clear, that the American definition of free trade is free trade for them and to other people's countries, and a totally protected American economy as far as those other countries getting into America is concerned. And if you don't believe me, ask an Australian sugarcane grower or Australian sugar industry, because the Aussies already have a free trade agreement with the States since, I think, '03. And the American sugar industry got written into that free trade agreement that no Australian sugar or sugar products or sugar cane could be considered for admission to the United States until 18 years after that treaty was signed. So if you think how wonderful will be a free trade agreement between New Zealand, ask an Australian sugarcane grower how good they think it is. As I've already said, the great majority of New Zealanders don't want a bar of being back in the American Empire, fighting its wars and hosting its spy bases, warships and military forces. The secret is to make people see the connection between the two, that seen in its proper context, the TPPA is not the Holy Grail, but a poisoned chalice. This is not wishful thinking. Independence from the American nuclear machine is a given, as far as the vast majority of New Zealanders are concerned. Our campaign needs to build on that to include independence from getting into bed with the US via trade and investment agreements. Now, I've already mentioned WikiLeaks. People here had a look at, or anyone here read WikiLeaks or had a look at them? One or two, right. I recommend you do, actually. Several of the released New Zealand cables, or the cables about New Zealand, spell out the American position on the TPPA and reveal the truth behind the lies peddled to the New Zealand public by our negotiators. Isn't that surprising? They say one thing to the New Zealand public, another thing to their American negotiators. Those cables also provide a priceless glimpse into all aspects of the US-New Zealand relationship, detailing what the Americans really think about us. So, for example, if you want to read their analysis of the 2005 election campaign, they judged that Don Brash would be more popular with New Zealand voters, ordinary family New Zealanders, because he and Helen Clark both held a baby at a rally, presumably not at the same time, and that Don Brash held the baby close to him, and therefore ordinary family-loving New Zealanders would relate to Don, whereas the cold, mannish, awkward Helen held the baby out there. And so, therefore, that was their level of analysis. That was it. So it must have been a bit of a shock when Don bit the bloody bullet, actually. So then John Key, suddenly those cables you follow through, John Key becomes the man. You also learn on those cables who their stool pigeons are inside the New Zealand political establishment. They name, for example, the Wellington Labour MP who took her entire staff along to the US Embassy for a US Embassy worldview briefing because she found it so fascinating, the briefing that she had received as an individual MP, so she thought the whole staff should get one from the American Embassy. They name the New Zealand Minister of Foreign Affairs who actually arranged for the US Embassy staff to be issued with swipe cards so that they could have 24 hours a day personal physical access to the New Zealand Defence Headquarters and Ministry of Foreign Affairs building, so they could be in there at all times talking to New Zealanders. They name the people who they describe as being on our team versus the other team, and they go through a list of departmental heads, including one I went to school with who went on to become an ambassador to the US, not mine more, and they go through and say these are the ones that are actually advanced our objectives, and they name, for example, the previous director of the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, Richard Woods, as being an obstruction to American interests because he would not allow, for instance, the installation of US equipment into the SIS headquarters in Wellington that would directly connect the SIS with the American Department of Homeland Security for the war on terror. And they say that as soon as Warren Tucker became director of the SIS, that equipment was installed and he was on our team as opposed to their team. Those cables name details of which network television and print journalists they consider to be on our team versus their team, which are the ones that are promoting an American agenda, which are the ones worthy of being invited to go on trips to the States, which network television journalist would be their source of information about New Zealand Muslims from telling them what was going on at the mosque in Auckland, for example. All those names are there. So they provide an uncensored and fascinating portrait of the empire in action, of who was shouting jump and who was replying how high. I recommend that all New Zealanders read them to get a rare glimpse of the truth, and I say 3 cheers for WikiLeaks. So actually they've done us a big service, there's more to come. Okay, we'll maybe move on.